Yo, what's going on, guys? So, look, I just wanted to start something new, a fresh channel right here on YouTube right now. Yeah, I'm excited to launch the channel. Yeah, so I want to waste no time getting into this now. I figured, just for the first series on this channel, let's just do Proverbs, right? Proverbs, right? This is obviously before Christ came to fulfill the law and abolish the reliance on the law, and so the reason I'm choosing this though is because it's still so practical. Proverbs is so incredibly practical that it's straightforward as well for the most part. And so this just comes from Solomon as well, who was a very successful man in his own right. And it was, as he got older, he got more wise, and so he was able to just drop a lot of that knowledge on us here in the Old Testament, guys. And so, without further ado, man, I'm thinking for this video we talk about Proverbs chapter 1 verse 7. Okay, and I'm going to read it right here for you guys. And by the way, I'm using the NIV version. Right here, as I read this, it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." And I'm on the YouVersion Bible app right now. It has a footnote right here. It says, "The Hebrew words rendered fool in Proverbs and often elsewhere in the Old Testament denote a person who is morally deficient." Okay, now what does it mean to be morally deficient right here in this context? We'll get into that later. I also want to give an alternative version for you guys, just because I know not all translations are the same, and I know some people have a better understanding and comprehensions of certain versions. And so I wanted to read it now from the ESV, the English Standard Version. By the way, the NIV is the New International Version, which is my favorite, but actually anyways, the verse reads like this in the ESV. It says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." Okay, and so that out the way, let's just unpack this verse right here, because I think it's so strong and I think it's so profound, but it can so easily just be not understood, I guess, to the fullest extent that it could be. And obviously we know that there is a level of understanding that us as mere humans cannot just get to, because there are just some things that are out of our understanding and comprehension as finite, or as human beings with a finite neurological ability, right? But let's just get into it, right? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Man, that's crazy, okay? Not in a bad way, but in a profound way, right? So look, this is setting the stage right here. Proverbs 1 verse 7 is not just a nice opener to the book of Proverbs, but it's basically the thesis statement of the entire book. And so everything Solomon writes about after this verse flows out of it. And so before we dig in, we need to understand that we are not looking at like just a verse that's just there to like warm us up, right? We're looking at the foundation of the book, okay? And so this verse, if you actually look at it, it breaks down into two halves that mirror each other. The wise man, who fears the Lord gains knowledge, and the fool who despises wisdom and instruction gains nothing. And so it's a simple structure, but it has devastating implications, okay? So what does fear of the Lord actually mean? Right, because I feel like this is the most important question to answer first, because most people either misunderstand it or water it down. Even with the most ambitious efforts from the people who were translating the text into its translation. So, like, for example, we read the NIV and the ESV. There's still an insane amount of value in looking at this at scripture in its original language. Okay, and so The Hebrew word used here, by the way, this is Hebrew because it's the Old Testament, is pronounced yirat, which carries the meaning of reverence, awe, and yes, a healthy trembling before God. It's not the kind of fear you feel watching a horror movie. It is closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon, shout out to Arizona, and realizing just how small you are. And so there is beauty in it, but there is also a lot of weight. John Calvin actually described it as a reverential awe that flows from a genuine recognition of who God is. It's not a blind terror. It is an orientation of the heart that says, God is God and I am not. All right. And then, this is backed up elsewhere in scripture too, though, because Isaiah chapter 6, 1 through 5 gives us a picture of what a genuine encounter with God looks like. And so when Isaiah saw the Lord high and lifted up, quote unquote, his immediate response was not excitement. It was, woe is me, for I am lost. That is the fear of the Lord. It is the collapse of self-sufficiency in the presence of perfect holiness. We see this as well in Psalm 111:10, which echoes Proverbs 1:7 almost word for word. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All those who practice it have a good understanding, right? And so the consistency of this theme across the Psalms and wisdom literature tells us that this is not an incident. It's a foundational principle that God keeps repeating because He knows we will forget it and keep forgetting it. And then also, let's talk about the beginning of knowledge, right? What is the beginning of knowledge? And so the Hebrew here for beginning is reshit, which can mean starting point, but also chief part or best part. So the verse is saying two things simultaneously. One, you cannot truly know anything until you start here. And two, this is the most important piece of knowledge you will ever have. And so if you actually think about it, this is a pretty radical claim, because Solomon is not saying that religious devotion is a nice add-on to education, but he is saying that if your knowledge is not rooted in the fear of God, it is usually not knowledge at all. It's information without wisdom and data without direction. And so we need to think about how Paul frames this in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 20-21, where he says, where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Right? Has God not made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom. And so Paul's point is that intellectual horsepower alone, it cannot get you to truth. It cannot answer the questions that matter most. Why am I here? What is right and wrong? How should I live? All right, all those questions. And so the fear of the Lord is the starting point because it establishes the right posture. You cannot learn well from a teacher you do not respect. You certainly cannot learn from God if you are approaching Him on your own terms, right? So next, let's talk about the fool, right? Because the second half of the verse is almost brutal in its directness. Fools despise wisdom and instruction, right? And so the Hebrew word for fools here is just straight up just evil. It's straight up just evil, which does not primarily describe someone with low intelligence. I think that's important, this distinction to make here, because I think oftentimes I can get badly conflated. But it describes someone who is morally obstinate, right? Like a willful rejecter. This is the person who hears wisdom and just rolls their eyes. The person who has been corrected and doubles down anyways. Okay, and so you actually see this later in Proverbs in chapter 12, where it says the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. And so, look, notice that pattern, right? The fool is not stupid. He is self-referential. His own opinion is the highest court of appeal. There is no room for God, no room for instruction, no room for anything that challenges his current trajectory. But this is also what Romans chapter 1 21 to 22 is describing when Paul writes about people who knew God but did not honor him as God. So their reasoning became futile, their hearts became darkened, they claimed to be wise and became fools, right? So the rejection of God does not leave the mind neutral because it just completely corrupts it, okay? The fool despises wisdom and instruction, which in Hebrew are chokmah and musar. Chokmah is skill and insight, and musar is discipline, correction, and training. So together they paint the picture of someone who refuses both the knowledge and the process of being shaped by it. So we're not just talking about a lazy person, we're talking about actively resistant. And by the way, guys, I just need to say this. If I were to tell you, if I were to just sit here and tell you and act like I have not been like this before in my life, bro, I would be capping so hard. In other words, I would be lying, right? Because I've absolutely been like this. I've absolutely been foolish in that regard. But it's all about being refined by God. So even if we start that way, if we recognize that we have those tendencies and we actively try to, I believe that if we actively try to work on that, then I think that truly is pleasing and glorifying to God, right? And so with that being said, let's now go to just a practical application here, right? Because here's where this lands in real life. And so I think the first takeaway, right, is that humility is not weakness. It is the prerequisite for learning. So look, like every professor, mentor, or coach we ever have can only teach us if we are teachable, right? And so the fear of the Lord is essentially the maximum form of teachability. It is saying to God, I do not have this figured out, you do. And that posture opens us up to receiving wisdom we never could have generated on our own. And so practically, I feel like this means approaching scripture, prayer, and even wise counsel with genuine openness rather than confirmation bias. A second takeaway, I think, is that knowledge without reverence produces arrogance, not wisdom. And so this is the story of a lot of intelligent people throughout history. High IQ, low character, right? Tremendous capability, zero accountability. The fear of the Lord is what keeps knowledge tethered to goodness. Without it, knowledge becomes a tool for self-promotion instead of service. And so I feel like we have to ask ourselves regularly, is what I am learning making me more humble, more loving, and more useful to others? And if not, something is off, okay? The third takeaway would be that correction is not an insult, it is a gift. Because what do we know? The fool despises instruction and the wise man runs toward it. So if we find ourselves getting defensive every time someone challenges our thinking, that might be a signal, right? Not always that they are right, but that we might be building walls around our ego instead of staying open. Even later in Proverbs, in chapter 9, it says, give instruction to a wise man and he will still be wiser. Teach a righteous man and he will increase in learning. Wisdom compounds when we stay correctable. And so with that being said, I just wanted to leave with this closing thought right here. Proverbs 1:7 is ultimately a statement about reality. It's not a religious suggestion. It's a description of how the universe actually works. Knowledge that is rooted in God is durable, directional, and life-giving. But knowledge that is divorced from Him is impressive on the surface and hollow underneath. The invitation of this verse is simple, even if it is not always easy. Just start with God. Stay humble, stay correctable. Let the fear of the Lord be not just the beginning of our knowledge, but the anchor of our entire life. In one of his most famous books, Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis puts it this way, right? Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less.